Good morning, friends. Greetings from Friendship Meeting in Greensboro, North Carolina, part of North Carolina Yearly Meeting Conservative. And I meet with you today under the oversight of that monthly meeting, which has issued a travel certificate for my public ministry. And that minute has been forwarded to your clerk, and your meeting's endorsement, when returned, will help me be accountable to the Friendship Meeting community and will help them decide whether or not I should be allowed to do this kind of stuff in the future. And I will speak this morning in the spiritual vocabulary that is most authentic for me as a Quaker Christian. And this is not everyone's vocabulary. I encourage each of you to listen in tongues, to try to hear the truth behind the specific words I may use, and translate that truth into your own authentic spiritual vocabulary. I believe that this mutual listening and translating is the best path to the freedom we all seek in meeting, to be heard when we were doing our best to be authentic. More about listening in tongues later. Understanding Quaker waiting worship and participating in it fully begins with knowing who we are. One way of describing that is to say that Quakers are people who have bumped into God and have been changed by the encounter. That places us in the group of religious people called mystics, but we're distinctive even within that unusual group. We're also people who have discovered that the perceptible presence of God is offered continuously, and that we can consciously shape our lives to become more sensitive to and more receptive to that presence. And finally, we're people who have discovered that the presence can be felt and answered as a community even more strongly than as individuals. So we gather together regularly, waiting for and expecting the shared transforming experience of God's presence. And these discoveries, experienced in the gathered community as well as individually, have shaped our form of waiting worship and guide our preparations for it. To be fully present to the movements of the Holy Spirit in meetings for worship and at other times requires our constant attention and intention. The work of preparing ourselves for the presence of God falls into three broad areas: which I call the spirituality of subtraction, the conversion of manners, and listening in tongues. Like most things in the spiritual life, they overlap and interlock boundaries, but I find it helpful to think in these general categories. Because Quakers have felt the perceptible guidance of God in so many settings and so many times, expectedly and unexpectedly, we have wanted to live in a way that maximized our ability to recognize that presence at any time and to hear it more clearly without distraction. And like religious people in various faith traditions, Quakers have done that in part by practicing a spirituality of subtraction. And this means simply the process of examining every part of one's life and subtracting from that anything that might interfere with the ability to perceive and respond to the divine presence and receive its guidance. If any part of life may be part of the divine dialogue or may distract us from it, then every part of our lives must be tested by the question, does this help me hear, pay attention, and follow God's guidance or not? If the answer is yes, fine, we can keep that and embrace it. But if the answer is no, then that thing, however respected that is generally, or favored by me personally must be subtracted from my life. So we must be diligent in the practice of the spirituality of subtraction. Be vigilant constantly of all aspects of thy life, asking whether each one aids or hinders thee on thy quest to hear, to understand, and to respond faithfully. If God comes to us directly and guides us without intermediaries, then it is up to us to develop the ability to tell what is God and what is not. And when that voice guiding us is God, and when it's just our wanting to stay comfortable or look good to the Joneses next door, we need to eliminate distractions and focus on the really real. And that's what a spirituality of subtraction does. My metaphor for this is the regular weeding that our garden requires in order to produce an abundant harvest. But weeding out the unhelpful bits is not all that my spiritual garden needs in order to thrive. It is equally important to nurture those plants that contribute to the intended harvest, and identifying those habits and practices that increase our ability to participate in the divine dialogue, to hear more clearly the guidance being offered and to respond to it is essential. And in Quaker terminology, this is the lifelong effort called the conversion of manners. We can't control the experience of the immediate presence of the Holy Spirit. We can't make it happen, but we can make ourselves more prepared for it so that when it does happen, we recognize the opportunity and can benefit fully from it. One example of practicing the conversion of manners is keeping a spiritual journal. To practice viewing the events of one's life from a spiritual perspective and recognizing lessons to be learned from everyday events. And again, building up the right mix of habits, skills, and activities in one's life is just as important as weeding out those things that are unhelpful. Over the generations, friends have found it very important to be in the regular practice of daily individual worship, to intentionally set aside some part of each day in private worship. And how long is not the important thing, neither is worshiping at the same time or in the same place. But in basketball or pottery, cooking or reading, we find it easy to believe that more practice helps build skill, and neglecting practice erodes it. And how many times has Lee ever said, "I'm a little out of practice," to explain not doing well at a task? I know I have, more than once. Worship is the same way. We learn to set aside our business and our distractions to focus on our relationship with God by setting them aside and focusing over and over again. I wrote in my journal that after about 1,000 meetings for worship, I was beginning to feel like I was finally getting the hang of it, finally understanding its true potential and how I could be fully present. I was thankful at that moment that I was in the habit of spending more than 1 hour, 1 day a week in meeting for worship. Now, finally, it's important to remember that we're mystics, as has been described, but we are in particular a mystical community. The core of our religious practice is a shared experience of the transformative presence of God. Our meeting for worship is not a room full of individuals, each meditating separately. It is a fusion of personalities gathered in the shared search for a particular experience that's beyond the ability of any of us to put fully into words, but is nevertheless very real. The Creator, who so loves diversity in all the natural world, that no two oak trees or furry rabbits are exactly alike cannot be satisfied if we limit our spiritual understanding or expression to a single vocabulary or metaphor. It is important that we become fluent in more than one spiritual description of the world so that we don't mistake the words we use for the truth behind them. We need to become more fluent in many authentic languages that are used to express this feeling of God's presence and guidance. So we need to practice opening ourselves to the experience of corporate waiting worship. Let down your guards and defenses so that you can share that experience. Disarm yourselves in word and thought so that it is safe for everyone else to let down their defenses and share in that sense of presence and guidance. In a day and age when there are so many different vocabularies being used to describe what is essentially beyond words, practice listening in tongues. Resist the temptation to insist that all language in worship be the language thee uses. Instead, ask thyself, what is the truth beyond words in the ministry that is being offered? If we practice these things, then we will be able to say yes to the old query. We do come to worship with hearts and minds prepared, open and ready to worship in silence or vocal ministry or prayer as the inward guide leads us. It is an outcome well worth the effort. Let us settle.